Hello, welcome to another lecture on network security. In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at authentication, authorization, and accounting, something that is normally shortened as AAAS or AAA. So, when we think about these three components of AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting, these are things that we use not only in the network realm, not only just in computer security realm, we also use those information in many other places. So basically, when we say we are doing authentication, what we try to do there with authentication is we are trying to prove who we are. So it is a way to prove who we are. So that is authentication. So let's look at an example of using credit cards. So when we think about a credit card example, the fact that you have a card and that card has a card detail, expiry date, these type of information is what we normally use to prove who we are. That is authentication. Then once you authenticate, once you prove that you are that particular person that who you claim to be, then in the case of a credit card, you should know that there will be a credit limit and you can only spend up to that limit. So that is what you can do with that. So that is authorization. That is how much you can spend in the case of a credit card or what you can do in a system, for example, is what we may call as authorization. So that is how much or what we can do with the information that we have. After proving who we are, authorization would be the next step. They are totally different things. But in addition to this, it would be really useful for us to have a record of everything that we have done using these information, or rather using the steps of authentication authorization will let us do certain things. For example, in the case of a credit card, it will let us purchase items. Then it would be really useful to have a record of all those activities so that we can go back and see what has happened. So in the case of a credit card, we can go back and see where we have spent the money. So that is known as accounting. So the similar thing we can do in computer systems as well. So we can identify ourselves using authentication. We can be allowed to do certain things through authorization, and then our actions can be recorded and used for later analysis in accounting. So first, when we think about authentication, here the main purpose or main thing that we are trying to do with authentication is proving who we are. When we think about network security and when we think about devices that are connecting to a router, for example, and the router wants to perform certain authentication, it wants to establish that you are a rightful user to access that router. So there are a couple of ways we can do authentication in this scenario. One is called local authentication. The other one is called server-based authentication. When we think about local, the idea is you will still be asked for a username and a password. So the user would connect to the system. So the user is going to connect to the system. Then it will prompt for a username and a password. So then the user will provide the username and password, then the device itself will look up on its local database. So the idea here is the password, username are stored in a local database, and it can see whether the user is allowed into the system. On the other hand, if we think about server-based authentication, here the user will establish a connection to the router. In this case, router will ask for username and password, but once that username and password is provided, router will go back to a third-party server, which would be identified as an authentication server or a AAA server, and that would be where the username and passwords would be stored. So it would not be stored locally, but it would stored in a server. And once that server decides whether this user should be allowed or not, then that will be enacted by the router. So the main difference between local authentication and server-based authentication is where this information is being stored. Particularly the information for authenticating the username and password, are they stored locally on the device or are they stored remotely on a server? Then the second one is authorization. With authorization, here the main question is what the user can do. So with authentication, we have established who the user is. So we have answered the question of who. Now, after that session is established, so again it can be established, then the question about authorization is what the user can do. So we first establish, okay, a remote user is connecting. We go to the server. Say if we are using server-based authentication, we talk to the server and we establish that they are who they are. So we do the authentication part. Once the authentication is done, now the router can go and request, okay, this user is requesting to do this task or this service, should we allow? So again, now the server can make that decision in terms of whether it is going to allow or deny for that particular authorization request. So this is the authentication request and this is the authorization request. So those are two different things. Authentication request will establish who a user is, and the authorization request will establish what that user can do. Accounting is, we are going to typically save a number of information after a user is granted authentication and authorization, and we are going to record a number of activities this user is performing. So the commands that they may be issuing and the activities that they may be performing. So these type of information, we will keep on forwarding them to the accounting server. So the accounting server will keep a record of all the activities that are being performed by the user. So it will send different types of messages relevant to network. So what is their connection, or from where they got connected, their connection type, what commands they issued, what resources they used. So these type of information can be stored as part of this accounting. So they will be sent as a set of messages to the accounting server as long as the user is using the system. So that is accounting. So this is mainly to keep a record of all the activities happening within our networking environment. within our computing environment, essentially. Now let's look at some simple examples in terms of how local AAA authentication can be configured in devices, in networking devices. So when we think about local authentication, this is pretty much fairly straightforward, because the usernames and passwords are normally stored locally on the device itself. So we may generate a pair of usernames and passwords, or maybe multiple pairs of usernames and passwords, and those things get saved on the device. So we will add a set of usernames and passwords, then they will go into the router database. Then after that, we will go and enable a AAA model. So we will enable a AAA model and authentication, authorization, and accounting model on the router. And then we will configure how that AAA model is going to work. So we can specify the AAA authentication login is going to be based on the local. So this is where we specify it as a local authentication scenario. So that is the basic way of configuring authentication, particularly for administrative access on a Cisco router device or switch or similar devices. When we think about authentication methods, or when we think about the commands that we may use here, there are a number of things that we can do. Things like enabling, so that is where we enable the use of password for authentication. By specifying local, we specify it is going to be a local username database. If we specify local case, then we are specifying it is a case-sensitive username that we are using. It is a local username and also a case-sensitive username. If we give it as none, then we are not using any authentication. And then in addition to this, we can do things like group radius, group tax SCS plus, and group specifications. These are mainly used for server-based authentications. We will look at those a bit later on. But the main idea is we'll use the similar command where we establish a AAA model and then we specify the parameters for that. And here in this example, what we are seeing is we are doing a similar thing, but here we are also specifying an SSH login case. So, in addition to the default one, we can give a name for a set of usernames. So we can specify a set of usernames as the default set of usernames, and then we can also specify some for SSH login, and then again we can specify that list as part of our login authentication. So these are some additional configurations we can do in such devices. In addition to this, we can also specify certain other things such as max atoms, or like how many unsuccessful atoms are allowed. So this is, again, you may be familiar with this, where say for example, after 3 incorrect atoms with a password, a user account could be locked out. So this is to avoid people trying to brute force into a system with password guessing. So we can and disable those things. This type of an option is also available, and it is a good idea to use such an option so that people, particularly with password guessing and so on, this can be a way of avoiding that. And if we go into, say, show AAA sessions, we can see the users that are currently actively in and so on. So again, some of these additional commands can be used for, in addition to configuration, we can use them for validation, verification, and so on. Now let's look at how we can go about configuring a server-based authentication or server-based AAA setup. So particularly when we think about the main differences between local and server-based authentication, the main difference is in a local authentication, the username and passwords are stored in the local database. So all the information is stored within the device itself. But one of the disadvantages is if we have a large number of devices that we are managing, then we'll have to create all these accounts, manage all these accounts across all these devices. Whereas if we use certain remote servers, now all the devices, so if we have a number of routers, for example, the other routers can also talk to the same authentication server. So all of these routers can equally share the information that is available in a central point, or sometimes even at multiple points. So they can use a number of authentication servers in combination. Whereas if we use the local approach, we'll have to replicate that across all the routers. So we have to go and create these information, these account information, passwords, and so on each of these devices. So when we think about how the main sort of steps that would be taken in authenticating, in establishing a server-based authentication and authorization, the user would connect to the router, for example. Router would ask for the username and password, and the user will provide that. Then router will go and establish and verify the authentication, and after that has been verified, the user will be able to continue with additional requests and so on. So the initial establishment is the main sort of differentiation that we would see here. There are many sort of different types of remote authentication systems, remote access control systems. When we think about Cisco devices, there's what is called Cisco Secure Access Control System, and Cisco Secure Access Control System supports a couple of different protocols for communication between these AAA servers and the clients. In this case, for example, a router and these servers can communicate using a number of different protocols. An example is TACACS plus or Radius. So these are some examples of such protocols. Among these protocols, there are a number of key differences. Particularly, one is mainly sort of Cisco specific or mainly available in Cisco devices, and the other one is more open implementation protocol. And one is on TCP, the other one is on UDP. And particularly with Radius, it supports a lot of extensive accounting type messages. So it will we can use it to set up a lot of accounting based information. So different one of sort of we we can have different sort of advantages and disadvantages, rather mainly sort of different main differences between these systems. One of the sort of main sort of differentiations between this is sort of the flexibility that we will get in terms of the functionalities. Particularly with Radius, one of the things is it is going to combine all the three, at least, or rather, authentication and authorization and accounting can be done separately, but it can be slightly inflexible. Whereas with here we can have each of those components implemented in a sort of a modular architecture. And another sort of key difference, particularly from a security standpoint, is here entire packet is encrypted, here the password is encrypted. So there are various reasons why each one of those may be used, particularly if you are mixing up different devices from different vendors and so on. So there may be a requirement to using one or the other depending on those. But the general idea is fairly similar. It's a server-based AAA protocols. So this one just shows the TAC-ACS authentication process. So the basic idea is a lot of the activities are going to go back and forth between the server. For example, client is connecting to the device, then the device is connecting to the server, then it is prompting the username prompt is provided, username is provided, username is sent, then password is prompted, then then it is asking for the password is provided, then it is going to send back the information saying whether it is accepted or rejected. So that is the basic authentication flow in TAC-ACS Plus. Whereas in Radius, what is going to happen is the device is going to prompt for the username, then you provide the username, it is going to prompt for the password, you provide the password. Once it has collected that information, it is going to provide that to the server and get the response back. So the main difference is here in most of these situations, all the communications are happening between these two parties. So it is sort of going in between. Whereas here, most of the communication is happening between, and then the authorization, authentication request is sent onwards. So that is one of the main differences that we would see in the authentication process between these two protocols. Then when we think about using these either TAC-ACS or Radius protocols with Cisco devices, we would integrate them with the Cisco Secure Access Control System, access control servers, and we can selectively enable which one we may want to use depending on our requirements. In addition to this, we could also use other things. There's no requirement that we only have to use the Cisco secure servers here. We can even use things like Windows servers like Active Directory, like sometimes even Azure Active Directory and things like that. They can be used as long as we have an authentication protocol that can talk to those servers. We can use those as well. So there's sort of no limitation in terms of we have to stick to something specific like that. Particularly if an organization is using something like this, an Active Directory kind of a situation, a setup for their overall authentication or overall access control system, that can be interconnected with the networking devices as well. So if we look at how server-based AAA authentication can be configured, the basic idea is that we would enable AAA. We'll have to specify the server, and we'll have to specify a secret key for communicating between the server and the client. So the router has to have a secure connection between the server and the router. Then after that, we can specify what authentication protocol that we are going to use, and we can set up the AAA server like that. So we'll have to set up a AAA model, and then we can go and specify the server that it needs to connect to. We can specify the address, the type of connection, the secure key for that, and that would be the way that we would establish a server. So depending if we have a number of different servers, we can configure them as well, 2 different servers. So if it is a Radius server, then we may have to specify the authentication ports and stuff like that, but the general idea is still the same. So again, the main thing to remember between authentication and authorization is authentication is about ensuring the end user is a legitimate user. The end user is who they are. So by using a password in this case, we establish that they are the particular user that we want to allow into our system. Authorization is what we allow them to do, which parts of the network that we are allowing them to use, which programs or services that we are allowing them to use. So that is the part of authorization. So authentication is about the legitimacy of the end user. Authorization is about allowing or disallowing those users. So that is the main difference that we need to keep in mind. So this is not just for network security, this is the general principle across security anyway, but we just need to keep that in mind. Then between these authentication protocols, the protocols that we can use for that, the main difference is TSAs, it separates authentication from authorization, so we can have them implemented separately, implemented in different systems, whereas Radius, it is done together, so we cannot separate that. So that is one of the main differences there. Now, if we look at some of the configuration commands, they are not that complicated, so to speak. We just go into AAA authorization, and then we specify what type of authorization we want to set up, and we can have a number of options as seen here. We can set up cache groups, then what to do if an authentication is success, whether we are using local or server, so these type of additional things that we can set up. So for example, we can set up some local usernames and passwords, but then we can also go and specify a network group there. What is the network group, what is the authorization, and how we do that. So now when we think about accounting, so what we have discussed so far is about authorization and authentication, establishing who the user is and making sure what they can do. But accounting is also an important aspect, particularly with networking. When we think about network security, the only way that we can go back and figure out what might have gone wrong in a situation, or who might have done something. The only way to do that is if we have some record of such things happening in our network. So a way of doing that is having an account of our actions, account of the actions of the users, so that we can go back to that and verify what has happened, what was wrong, what is correct, and things like that. So if we think about sort of setting up accounting, is basically what we are going to do is we are going to specify what are the things for which groups we are going to enable authentication, enable accounting, and what are the things that we are going to account there. So again, these are again sort of configuration syntaxes. Here you can see some examples here in terms of what we are going to do in terms of accounting here. So basically what we want to do is, once a user is authenticated, we want to account all the relevant information based on that. So how did they connect, all these information we want to have there. So that is what we would mainly try to configure when we are configuring accounting. In addition to these, we may also come across things like 8021X port-based authentication. So here the idea is the device that is connecting for authentication or connecting to the authenticator, those devices themselves can establish certain level of connectivity. So depending on both these devices being able to exchange, say, 8021X messages, so depending on the nature of those network capabilities of those devices, they themselves can go and establish those communication parts, and then onwards the radius access requests can happen, and authorization can be done like that. So here it is not based on a user trying to provide username and password. It is rather sort of happening in the background, happening in the underlying level. So that is port-based authentication, and this would be particularly useful when we want to authenticate devices, but devices that don't have a lot of user intervention. So these are background systems that are trying to connect rather than the users. There's no particular user who is trying to connect, and this may be a suitable approach there. So we can go and configure port-based authentication on interfaces. So if we have a switch or there, we can go and configure port-based authentication using authentication port control command, and this is the basic syntax for setting up that. So if you think about a .1x authentication, so we would specify a AAA model. We'll specify a radius server. We'll give the radius server details as we would do. But then after that, we will go into authentication and 1.x group. We'll set up a 1.x group, and there we would go and specify the what can be done for those interfaces and so on. So that is the basic idea of configuring a port-based authentication. So that is a very brief look at authentication, authorization, and accounting. This is not just relevant to network security. It can also be, many of these concepts are particularly authentication and authorization, even accounting, are principles that are used across computer security. But even when we think about network security, there's a good need for using them, and hence we are doing that. So things that you need to understand is why we may want to use local authentication, for example, and what is the rationale for going for a server-based authentication method, and then knowing what are the suitable protocols if you are going with server-based, what are the advantages and disadvantages of different protocols, and the basic idea of configuring these authentication, authorization, and accounting on basic networking devices, routers, and switches, and so on. So that is mainly the sort of set of things I wanted to discuss in today's lesson. I will additionally post some additional information and possibly some activities on LMS, so please refer to those as well. And if you have any questions, please let me know and we can have a discussion possibly next week if everyone is available. And that would be useful as well, so we'll try to do that. Until next time, thank you for joining in for today's lesson, and bye.